Deep in the woods of an extensive forest south of Nunspeet, Netherlands, there resides a park with the remains of a house with a very, very dark and disturbing history. In 1895, Frank Willem van Vleuten of Dutch purchased 360 acres of land and founded the company Nieuw Nunspeet with his brother Willem. Van Vleuten cultivated the land. He planted trees and crops and brought many different types of animals, including pigs, cows, horses, chickens, ducks, turkeys, and peacocks, onto the property. And in 1906, the first stone was laid of a round villa, which would become known as Het Ronde Huis, or the Roundhouse. The Roundhouse had 3 floors and a flat roof. A balcony surrounded it, and on the 3rd floor, the gallery received daylight through a colored glass dome on the roof. It looked like any other beautiful house. But the truth was that the house was surrounded by conspiracies and rumors, allegations of occultism, Satanism, and the like encased in its round walls, and in the park where its remains lie today. Join me as we dive down this deep, dark rabbit hole on a subject you've probably never heard of, dealing with a house that could be one of the most evil places on Earth, where powerful played games with children, took innocence, performed rituals, and embraced the darkness. I'm your host, Colin Browen, and you're watching The Conspiracy Files. All right, everybody. I hope you have had a great week so far. It's going to be Wednesday when this comes out, as always. I just want to remind everybody that if you want to listen to the show uncensored, you can listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. Just look up The Conspiracy Files. Also, please leave me a comment on this video and like the video. Make sure you're subscribed. Those comments and likes really help boost the engagement, which helps push these videos out to more people. So if you want to help in your own way with this stuff, that's definitely a great way that you can do it. I always say this at the beginning, but I don't plan on doing anything to myself. So if something does happen in the near future, it wasn't by my own hand. I hate that I have to say that, but I really do get concerned sometimes, especially people in the comments. Always telling me that I need to be concerned. Freaks me out a little bit more. But yeah, if you also would like to read more about this subject, a lot of the articles that the information from this show was gathered from are written in Dutch. So they're hard to translate and hard to read. But if you want to take a look through all that stuff, there's a resources document in the description of the show. So you can go check out all the links, read all the documents, and see for yourself that we're not making stuff up here on the show. I want to thank Rebecca for helping research and write this script and bring this whole thing to life. And without further ado, guys, this is a really, really dark one. And I'd never heard of this place until somebody on one of my videos here on the Conspiracy Files commented and said, you should look into this place next. And I did. And wow. It's like every single country has a place like this. In Belgium, it's the Chateau d'Ameroy. In the United States, I mean, you got a number, but the main one's really like Epstein Island or North Fox Island. In England, it's the Guest House. There are certain spots that seem to become magnets for evil, and the Roundhouse that we're talking about today is one of those places. And as always, I want to warn everybody, this is a graphic and disturbing show, so there are going to be some unpleasant details we're going to go over, so viewer and listener discretion is advised. First, we need to look into the history of the Roundhouse. So, Frank van Vleuten was a son of the philosopher and freethinker Johannes van Vleuten, 1818 to 1883, who's known as a Spinoza expert and contributed to the spread of modern humanism. He received a liberal education and was not baptized. Frank's 3 sisters all married well-known avant-garde artists from the circle of the Tigers. The writer Frederick van Eden, who founded the workers' commune Walden in 1898, was Frank's brother-in-law, as was the poet and essayist Albert Verwey. In 1888, Frank van Vleuten had married Constance Lands and had 2 sons. They settled on the 2 support floors of the Roundhouse, while the supervisor and his family lived on the lower floor. Later, in 1908, Constance accused Frank of having committed adultery with a governess, which dissolved his marriage. In 1915, Frank remarried the 26-year-old Henriette Vreed and returned to the Roundhouse. There, the couple had 2 daughters and lived in the Roundhouse for another 10 years or so. In 1930, Frank van Vleuten died, leaving his estate divided and sold, and the Roundhouse became property of Staatsbosbeheer, a Dutch forest organization, and from that point on, the home began to deteriorate. During the Second World War, the house was used as a labor camp of the Dutch Arbeidsansatz. Nearby refugees hid in the forest in a shelter, later to become known as the Verscholendorp, or Hidden Village. In 1944, a Rheinbote ballistic missile launch pad was constructed on the estate of the Roundhouse, and after the Second World War, the former labor camp became a family resort for socially weak families. And finally, in 1967, it was decided by local government members that they would demolish the Roundhouse because it had fallen into such disrepair. So, what was so suspicious and surprising about the so-called Roundhouse in which Van Vleuten had built? Seems like it was just a regular old house inhabited by a regular old family. But this place was absolutely so much more than that. And now we get into the conspiracies. The first we're going to talk about is prostitution and drinks. Oh my. The first newspaper reported suspicious rumors surrounding the Roundhouse in the year 1976. The first article in Non-Speet Verroet, written by Dirk Scepter, had called on readers to send him photos and more information about the Roundhouse. He revealed that the eccentric Frank Van Vleuten had a very bad reputation, accusing him to have remarried an orphan girl of Chinese-Indonesian descent in 1911. At the time, according to this author, the bride was supposedly unconscious and only 16 years old, and according to forest workers who witnessed some of this stuff, she was treated very poorly by Frank. Additionally, Scepter in his article mentioned that after his first marriage, Van Vleuten was said to have lived for some time in the Roundhouse with a woman and several young girls. He was also said to have been involved with a in Nunspeet, and during the First World War was alleged to have lured young Belgian refugees to a house near Hulshorst. These girls were then sent via the Roundhouse to frontline in Germany. Keep in mind, these girls were allegedly very young and minors. They were said to be given away as a business gift, these girls were, after a long journey from Batavia on the Merchant Navy to the Netherlands, and many were of Indian descent. Around 1916, the remains of an unknown girl were found in the wooded area near the Roundhouse. And according to Scepter, the author of this initial article, he was told during his investigation that gentlemen in large, luxurious fur coats and top hats would leave departing from the local train from Amersfoort on the wrong side of the train when it was dark, and later on transfer unnoticed in Nunspeet to a tram carriage that then took them to Neo-Sorel, which was a... So apparently there were these very rich men arriving on the trains in the area. They would exit the train from the wrong side of the train so that they wouldn't be seen by people that were there in the area. Then they would take like a midnight tram, a secret, carriage service to a completely undetected, unnoticed. They would do this in the dead of night so that no one could see these rich, powerful men doing these things. And according to this author, Frank Van Vleuten, the guy who built the Roundhouse, was supposedly forced to sell it after his first divorce. One of the drivers of the local train that those men in fur coats and top hats rode on said that his mentor had once seen a man and a woman with two little girls get into the tram in the 1890s. The children were dressed in black and wore black cloths over their faces. Author Agnes Teben of Skepsis noted in 2012 that it's possible that the children that tram driver had seen weren't there voluntarily. And reportedly, those kids had those veils over their faces not because they had been at a funeral recently, but because the adults were trying to conceal the fact that the children were drugged and didn't know what was going on. Additionally, the train driver also said that workers were sometimes forced to let their young daughters work at Neo-Sorel, and that he'd heard from multiple people that once these workers allowed their daughters to work at the for one night, they would never see them again. Keep in mind, we're talking about daughters that are very, very young. We're talking children working at this. In regards to that tram, that phantom midnight tram that supposedly went to the Roundhouse and was pulled by a horse through the forest, Scepter, the author of that article, indicated that there were stories going around the town that were a bit like something shown in a horror film. That's a direct quote, but he claimed that no one dared to speak about it openly. They were afraid of what might happen. Scepter, the author, wrote about a system of tunnels underneath the Roundhouse and about a young girl who had apparently seen something terrible happening at a well in the area around the year 1900, writing in the article that, quote, "She can never tell what she saw there at the well. She ran away and never went back to that area." End quote. Dirk Scepter, that news reporter, reported that he obtained all the information for his article from Johan Motenberg, the son of a railway engineer and the person who bought the disused tram carriage that used to run to the Roundhouse. He renovated the tram and built a small railway around his house in Jop, a village below Deventer. In 1968, he opened Pony Tram to Jop, which was especially advertised towards children. They wanted children to come ride this tram. Now, Motenberg, the son of that railway engineer, did research of his own to find out more about the history of the tram, but he only discovered rumors about the Roundhouse. Motenberg told visitors that his pony tram had once been used to transport high-ranking gentlemen to a in the area, but he didn't know any names and he didn't know exactly where they were going. In a blog about the Roundhouse on blogspot.com, Motenberg supposedly also provided the following information. Quote, "It was well known that girls who were involuntarily traveling to and drugged and feared were dressed in heavy mourning, with companions dressed in mourning. It was then not surprising when they were supported or held by their arms." End quote. So essentially they were dressing up these children that had been up in mourning gear, all black with veils over their faces, to cover up the fact that they were being and out in the open. And it obviously didn't raise any alarms when people saw these kids staggering and clinging on to adults around them, because they thought, I'm sure, that this was grief. You know, these kids were going through a lot. And they were in the process of being. But we have to go back to Motenberg, that railway engineer's son's blog. For example, Motenberg reported on a cavalry lieutenant from a well-to-of family who was on an exercise on the Veluwe in autumn 1921. According to Motenberg, this cavalry lieutenant's friend asked him to go experience something together in that area, and he knew where they had to go. So they hopped onto a tram and ended up at the Roundhouse in the woods, which he believed was a sex castle or a with a madame that liked expensive champagne. According to this story from this eyewitness, once inside the Roundhouse, they didn't find a madame, but a gentleman with a gray beard, who was allegedly Frank Van Vloten. Inside of the house, there was an iron staircase, a sort of stage. In a semicircle, there were a number of rooms without doors. The rooms were decorated in different styles, and in stiffened postures, there were young girls of different ages and races. Keep in mind, these young girls they're referring to were allegedly children. Along the blind back are wide sofas with pillows. So when the lieutenant and his friend walked in, they turned on a light in an old-fashioned decorated salon, where next to each other on a divan or couch, a dark and blonde girl seemed to lie like dolls under a white silk cloth. According to this eyewitness, his friend knew what he wanted because he immediately went for the young blonde child, and then told his friend that the other girl was his. According to this eyewitness, the young child was very nicely laid out and wasn't a day older than 14 years old. The child was wearing a pair of long, tight black leather gloves and a pair of very high-stitched, gold-colored doll shoes. And according to this witness, because he was an officer, because he had served in the armed forces, any army members or any soldiers could come to the Roundhouse and these children all day and night for free. And these girls were ultimately intended to be used at large gatherings. We're going to get into what that is in a second. The girls between 10 and 16 years old had all undergone very careful treatment. I'm assuming that that means like mind control treatment or drugging, whatever it was, to make them docile and okay with what was happening to them. The girls were of different races. They couldn't hardly walk. They had something called lotus feet, and the girls didn't speak. He didn't see any of the children talking. Now, that whistleblower also stated that he returned to the special house twice more during the day, a couple days later, in that same very special rail car. The dolls, as they call them, which are the children, were present in the large hunting room, during dinner in the dining room, on the terrace, and upstairs in the rooms. According to this witness, the girls were sitting or lying in fixed postures. They didn't really seem to move a lot. And the children of Asian descent only wore a kind of scarf upon their body. The other children wore silk dresses. And there were still others that were stuck in modern clothes. According to this guy, these children were treated like dolls, and they sat on their knees or lied on the floor with the gentlemen. The conversations that the men that were visiting the Roundhouse had were about politics, hunting, and other topics. There was good food and good drinks served there, and money was never a discussion point. According to this guy who saw all of this, he was told that everything and anything is possible with these young girls. He was told that you can go upstairs or go into the woods with them, or for a ride for the saddle, you name it. The host, the man with the gray beard, who we assume is Frank Van Vloten, the guy who built the house, allegedly told that lieutenant that he already knew that the lieutenant's preference was blonde. And and said that the blonde girl was only there for a short time and that the doctor had taken away all of the legs and cloves so that her feet had become a lotus foot. So let's just stop there for a second. So that's translated from a different language. So some of that description was a little hard to get through and understand and make sense. So the Roundhouse is this circular house in the woods, Ronde Huis. And apparently once you go inside, there's an iron staircase and it's a circular house. So they said there are all these rooms without doors. So these just open rooms. And this guy who was in there claimed that there were like children dressed like dolls, pretty much like almost entirely, some only wearing scarves, and they were positioned in these rooms, not moving, just waiting for men to come and them. So some of the girls had sheets over them. Some of them, were wearing these scarves. They were posed. They were sitting on the floor, kneeling down. And these were all children, keep in mind, age 10 to 16 years old. And they were all being held hostage in this roundhouse. They also learned through those interactions that military men, service members, could come to the roundhouse allegedly at any time and use any of these dolls. That's what they called these victims, dolls. And I mean, that's a really eerie, disturbing story. These children are conditioned to a point that they become shells of who they were. And an even more eerie detail is that none of the children there seemed to speak at all. They were just silent. They weren't moving, but they were alive. But back to the blog. The blog also reported that regular visitors to the Roundhouse were also invited to the nightly meetings in the forest, and they only invited men who had a certain future ahead of them. The blog also reported that regular visitors were also invited to the nightly meetings in the forest, and those men that were invited were men that had a certain future. So these were men that were going to be powerful in the world, future politicians, future leaders in the country in the Netherlands, future business leaders and CEOs. And they could choose to, at that point, become a member in this organization, and allegedly they were then told to a child in front of the whole group. This meant that they were then guilty in everybody's eyes that was in the group, but then they also knew that everybody else in the group was guilty themselves. So it was almost like an insurance policy. If you wanted to become a member of the group, you had to do in front of this group of men, so they all knew that you had done this thing and they could eventually tell people what you had done. And so you're not going to rat on those people because they know what you did. But then at the same time, you know exactly what all these other men did. So essentially it was like powerful business leaders, and they'd come and say, hey, if you want to join this club and you want to keep doing this stuff with us, this disgusting, you have to do this thing during this like group ritual in front of all of us. So we all have ammunition against you, because now you're going to have ammunition against us. So none of us are ever going to rat on each other, because it's kind of like the concept of mutually assured destruction, where if one person launches a nuke, everybody's going to launch a nuke, and it's just going to nuke half the world. It's the same concept here, where if one person ratted, everyone would rat. So nobody rats. Kind of like no one shoots nukes. A man named Hans Schalwick went to Jop in 1971 to take a look at that old tram that supposedly transported the powerful men out to the Roundhouse. And while he was there in 1971, he became very interested in Motenberg's stories about the Roundhouse and decided to investigate the case further in his spare time. Motenberg, the train engineer's son who wrote that blog post that we just discussed about the witness to the Roundhouse, also helped him investigate. This was just the very beginning of the Het Ronde Huis working group. This was essentially a citizens investigation group, and they collected, among other things, testimonies from workers who had directly worked for Frank van Vloten, who had seen what happened at the Roundhouse. Now, Hans's working group consisted of 7 people who wanted to investigate these stories, but to this day, he's refused to reveal the names of any of the other members in fear for their safety. Apparently, a few anonymous people were active on an internet forum called FOC, and they contacted this investigative group or belonged to it themselves. Once they opened up this internet forum and asked people, members of the public, for stories about the Roundhouse, over 75,000 messages were posted on the forum. Historian Wilmer Tall provided a lot of criticism of this investigative group's research and received new information and continued to be very secretive. And the mood of the general public after a while began to shift towards anti-investigation. There were historians that were coming out in public and in newspapers and everything saying all these things are lies, these are just allegations. And the public, which was once interested in the Roundhouse and what happened there, started to side with the historians who were coming out and saying, nothing ever happened. We know for a fact that all these people are innocent. And so that made this whole job a lot harder. Copies of the first 2 folders of investigative reports that this group generated circulated amongst a few journalists in the 1980s, but for a very long time, no one did anything with them. Essentially, this group of 7 or 8 citizen journalists who had dug up all of these things had gotten 75,000 comments on their posts on their forums and gathered all this information about the crimes against children that happened at the Roundhouse. They had sent all this information to journalists, and the journalists essentially looked at it and just moved on. They didn't want to touch it. It wasn't until 2006, decades later, that another shocking article about the Roundhouse appeared in Must magazine, written by investigative journalist Tom Biesman. Now, Tom reported that Frank Van Vloten, the guy who built the Roundhouse, was known in his community as the Black Devil, and that Dutroux, referencing Marc Dutroux, the monster of Belgium, who we've talked about extensively on this channel, he said that Dutroux type took place in the Roundhouse. Additionally, this investigative journalist stated that Van Vloten's second wife, whom he had apparently bought from a rich Chinese man, was called Zwarthy and sometimes sat naked in front of his horse. Remember, this Chinese girl was supposedly a minor who had been unconscious when she had, legally gotten married to Paul Van Vloten. Now, this is a quote from the article. He said, "When the Black Devil gets it on his hips, he dumps his naked wife among the workers in the woods with the words, 'Here, you do with her whatever you want,'" end quote. Now, Schalwick and Montenberg, 2 of those investigators that were trying to break the news about the Roundhouse for years, are said to have heard during their investigations from a former forest worker who told them that sometimes a mysterious black carriage would drive through the forest with girls sitting on it that had black clothes and veils over their faces. This forest worker also told the 2 men that he had never seen his 12-year-old sister again after she had gone to work at the house for one night. Essentially, remember back earlier on I told you that people were so financially strapped back then that they were forced to let their daughters and siblings go work at these, or specifically the Roundhouse, and then they'd go missing and just disappear. Additionally, that investigative reporter who published the article in 2006, Biesman, wrote that the 2 men, Montenberg and Schalwick, the investigators, had visited a psychic named Delius Pitt in 1980, and this psychic had confirmed that Frank Van Vloten was a sex maniac, and claimed that the old Prince Hendrik had also visited the Roundhouse to engage in deplorable acts with children. In 2009, Biesman, that investigative journalist, was approached by Scepter, the guy who wrote the first article exposing the Roundhouse, who provided him with new information he had gotten from Canada. And so he contacted Schalwick, the other investigator from the task force, who agreed to provide material for a book that Biesman, the investigative reporter, wanted to write. It was then announced by his publisher that his book, Het Geheim van het Ronde Huis, was to be published in March 2012. But that never happened, due to a disagreement between the 2. According to Biesman, the investigative journalist, Schalwick, the investigator, didn't want to reveal from whom he had heard that Prince Hendrik was involved in the case. Additionally, Schalwick accused Biesman of recycling the story from another one of his books, and he said that Biesman was claiming he had investigated this thing when he actually hadn't. He had just stolen his own work. Interestingly, Schalwick, the investigator, then took all the research in the manuscript and published the same book in November 2012 with a different name, and sold all 1,000 self-printed copies quickly. After that, Biesman, the investigative journalist, sued him. But there were some explosive revelations coming. Schalwick's book claimed that Montenberg's grandmother, who descended from Willem III, was employed by the grain merchant Juriaan Juriaans, the owner of New Sorel, that original that we were talking about earlier, where the teenage girls would go to work and then disappear. Montenberg's grandmother was said to have worked there as a madam, so a woman that was in control of the children, them out. And apparently they discovered that after the Roundhouse was built out in the forest, the activities with the children, all that stuff was moved out there into the middle of the forest to avoid the eyes of law enforcement or, just regular members of society. They didn't want these rich people who were supposed to be respected, even princes and possibly kings and whoever else, to be seen going to a in the middle of the night, so they moved it out to the woods so that none of them would ever be seen going in or out. Schalwick's investigative group suspected that Montenberg's mother also became involved with the Roundhouse at that same time. Schalwick also claimed that Montenberg himself allegedly visited the Roundhouse once with his mother in 1912, but didn't want to say what she had to do with it. So Montenberg was the guy who at first was helping with the investigation and wanted to, get involved and learn about what these guys were talking about and share some of his knowledge and act like he was, eager to expose this stuff. But as the investigation went on, they started hearing that Montenberg's own family members were some of the people who were running the Roundhouse itself. This is all alleged, by the way. I just want to state that again. Now, the working group or investigative group heard that same thing later on from an unknown woman from a village in Twente, to whom Montenberg is said to have told the same story when she visited his pony tram. So apparently this guy Montenberg told another woman the same thing, that his mother helped run the operations at the Roundhouse. But for some reason he failed to disclose this to the people he was working with to expose the Roundhouse. But there's a reason why. It's because Montenberg's mother allegedly was pure evil. You see, Montenberg's mother is said to have brought in foreign prostitutes to the Roundhouse who were ritually and But what's interesting is that through conversations that the investigative group had with former workers of Frank Van Vloten and their relatives, it seemed that Frank wasn't an especially evil-seeming guy on the outside. He behaved somewhat unconventionally, but a lot of these people who had worked for Frank back in the day and their family members had somewhat decent memories of the guy. They told the investigators that Paul Van Vloten had helped many workers find work and that he paid them a lot better than others did. And for a while during the divorce, when Paul Van Vloten was in financial trouble for a while, some of his workers even offered to continue working for him for free for the time being because they loved him so much. However, the religious workers did find it terrifying that he regularly swore, which is a funny little detail. Now, in chapter 3 of the book that was published about the Roundhouse, there was a newspaper article from 1980 that read, quote, "In the New Sorrel," that was that brothel, "there were always more women and girls, even very young. Not all girls volunteered here. A forester with a gun guarded the house. They were there for the benefit of Jurian and his guests, a group of hunting friends. Those were very rich gentlemen, also from politics. Many of them, the rich men, never worked. Hunting, drinking, drugging, going to the throwing money. After hunting with floaters and visits to the New Sorrel in between, the evening continued at Hotel Smit, now Itman, where there was a lot of drooting. The owner, Mr. Smit, thought it was all fine. He received a royal financial compensation," end quote. So that newspaper article is basically discussing that this rich family man and a bunch of his very rich friends, some Nepo babies that, grew up rich and never had to work a day in their life, they would all go visit that in the town that the Roundhouse was outside of, and they would drink all night. The prostitutes and the children that were there, and then they would go to the hotel that was nearby and continue doing all these terrible things, sometimes even bring children into the hotel with them. And the owner of the hotel just thought it was fine. He didn't really bat an eye because he was receiving a lot of money for his silence. Additionally, the book mentioned a man named Anton Kroller, who claimed that he had found his own hunting paradise in De Hoop Velu, which was an area nearby. The book stated, quote, "Everywhere they were hunted, dirk, if only it was possible, from the party. From seal hunting on the Wadden Sea to bear hunting in Eastern Europe. The Roundhouse was also visited several times for hunting. For the sake of clarity, hunting to these men meant hunting, drinking, drugging, and women," end quote. So these men would go to the Roundhouse, they would drink, do drugs, and women and children. It was like their big thing. I don't know why in every conspiracy like this, there's like this hunting angle, kind of like at the Chateau de Amroy. They had these hunting parties with children. Here's another place where there's a tie-in between hunting and child. I think it's because it's like one big game to all these evil people. But the book also included a testimony on page 37 by an anonymous worker coachman, who as a coachman brought high-ranking guests to the New Sorrel. His quote in the book reads, "Arriving at the New Sorrel, I got a good tip from those gentlemen. In that house were girls, beautiful girls. They were not allowed to leave there. That's how it was then. A Mrs. Burgers also lived here. She was the boss of those girls. No one was allowed to come there. Additionally, on the grounds of the Ronde Huis, or Roundhouse, spectators have found many large holes that appear to lead to specific passageways. It was thought that they were somehow used or part of an intricate tunnel system underneath the house that was likely a part of," end quote. Interestingly enough, you can see one of those passageways in the following clip. Let it roll. Now, that's a little creepy, isn't it? That hole in the ground leading to a tunnel system, which in my mind connected the Roundhouse to other places in the area. Could it have connected the Roundhouse to that? I mean, to summarize all of this information up, there was basically this in the town that was guarded by armed guards. People testified that these rich men with fur coats and top hats would show up. They would secretly be taken on this special carriage to that. They would be, allowed entry into there. Inside of the were children. They went to work there. Some of them went to work there because they were destitute. Others were, there. But once they were inside, they were never allowed to leave again. Then eventually the was moved out to the Roundhouse. And the Roundhouse is, out in the middle of the woods. There's a tunnel system underneath the home. And allegedly there were also children that were and there as a part of the things that were happening. That's according to direct testimony from so many different people that are involved. But that's just the very beginning of all of this stuff. It's going to get so much darker. And keep in mind, this is all just conspiracy still. This is just another debunked story that apparently never happened. There's nothing to any of this, according to the government in the Netherlands. So now that you've got kind of a basic idea about the Roundhouse, we need to start talking about some of the bizarre and disturbing allegations of things that happened there, like weird phallic activities. Now, many workers who worked in that area around the Roundhouse reported seeing strange activities that occurred on the land around the Roundhouse. Entire hills were dug up to be rebuilt a little bit further away. Rice fields had to be constructed, but rice was never grown there. Large quantities of loam, sand, and lime were also transported out to the Roundhouse without anyone ever being told what they were for. They were essentially getting all of these materials delivered to the Roundhouse. Then when the delivery men would unload the stuff and, meet the people that were paying for it, the owners of the Roundhouse and the people running the place, they'd ask them, what are you doing with all this stuff? Like, this is a lot of sand and lime. They'd say, oh, don't worry about it. We got it handled. And there's still, to this day, no explanation officially as to what all those materials were used for. Well, one possible explanation is that Frank van Vloten, the man who built the Roundhouse, was appointed by the provincial executive of Gelderland as supervisor of agricultural test fields and carried out agricultural experiments in the area. Lime could have been used to fertilize the soil, although the investigative group suspects that it was quicklime, which is usually a material that's used to make corpses rapidly disappear. Hills were possibly sometimes dug up to be able to lay a railway line to a place where people wanted to cut wood. And for this, separate sections of narrow gauge railway were used that could be pushed together. The working group or investigative group, however, was convinced that many of these activities had something to do with dark rituals. That would also be the reason why Frank van Vloten had the Roundhouse built near the Mistibos in the forest, a crescent-shaped rampart, which was mistaken for an old Germanic meeting or court place. In 1938, the Roundhouse was investigated by the Leiden archaeologist Franz Christian Birch, who later joined the SS or the Nazis. However, he couldn't find any trace of Germans or Germanic culture. This bizarre pit on the property remained on the monument register for a long time, but in 1997, after some investigation, it was established that this was just a natural phenomenon. It had nothing to do with an ancient Germanic culture that was worshipping something. This area had come to be how it was completely by nature. Interesting. Now, in the late 1970s, investigators discovered a strange trench in the forest surrounding the Roundhouse, almost a mile southeast of the former home. A well had also been dug nearby, and it seemed like an attempt had also been made to dig up a stream or spring to get water flowing into the area. However, the investigative group had the strong impression that that excavation was supposed to represent a 60-meter long... I'm not kidding. Later, a depiction of the Cerne Abbas giant carved into the chalk hills of Dorset was discovered in the Birch's archive. This figure is 55 meters long and shows a naked man holding a club with an erect that's 7 meters long. The giant appears to represent the Greek hero Hercules and is believed by some to be ancient. However, he was only first described in 1694 and may have been intended as a parody of Oliver Cromwell, whom his enemies mockingly referred to as England's Hercules. The investigative group preferred to associate that giant with an ancient fertility cult and assumed that Birch had not accidentally kept him on his file on the Mistee. So it's weird. The government is claiming that there was nothing to this ancient kind of ritual ground, that the owners and people who visited the Roundhouse, play stake in. They like to visit that part of the property. They were making excavations around there. He said that it was nothing. There was nothing to do with it. It was all just, nature, and these people weren't doing anything weird. But in his file about that area from the official investigation, they had that picture of the giant with the huge that looked a lot like what was found in that area at the Roundhouse. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. You see, the phallic-shaped excavation could be a part of a larger geoglyph. The most famous one of these is the Nazca lines. You probably are familiar. However, the group did succeed in recognizing a gigantic image of Woden in the landscape, formed by paths, dikes, ditches, vegetation, etc. And that explained the strange activities that the workers spoke about. So they did find a geoglyph from above, which is insane. So the people who built the Roundhouse, in the late 1800s, 1900s, those people constructed geoglyphs of these weird mythological creatures and beings. Huge pieces of artwork that could only be seen from the sky, including this one of Woden. So is it really far-fetched that they may have tried to construct a geoglyph of a gigantic, erect, a giant with a huge in the land? You see, from an aerial perspective, the location of the Roundhouse and the surrounding property has been compared to the likes of the Eye of Woden. The Eye of Woden is based on a Norse myth in which Odin gave up his other eye to drink from the source of wisdom, although the eye in relation to the house is placed somewhat oddly. Now, Woden's mustache and beard are formed by a conifer forest. The driveway to the Roundhouse is an eyebrow, and a cycle path is supposed to represent one of his legs. The image of Woden looks like a primitive child's drawing, but it's especially surprising that Woden appears to have a very small in relation to his body length. Unfortunately, the investigative group does not show how you can project Woden onto an old military map. Nothing seems to be correct. In response to this criticism, an anonymous member of the investigative group stated on that forum that even his 8-year-old nephew had managed to draw Woden onto a military map after just an hour of trying to do so. But despite repeated requests, this drawing was never revealed or shown. When the investigative group searched the area around the Roundhouse and around that shaped excavation with a metal detector, they recovered about 10 glass honeypots near the pit. The lids on the honeypots had rusted through, so at that point they were full of forest soil. Schalkwick, one of the investigators, then stored them in his garage. Only later did it occur to them that, given their location, they probably represented drops of and might have been filled with the blood of children or with from participants in a ritual. A business associate of Schalkwick was willing to analyze the contents in his laboratory. He took those honeypots and he wanted to see exactly what had been inside of them. Unfortunately, Schalkwick then went back into his storage and discovered that those honeypots had been lost. They simply disappeared, and he didn't know what happened to them. So to sum all of that up, I know this is kind of a heavy one. They found that area, which seemed to be a giant that was excavated in the ground. They found these honey pots around them, which they assume contained, materials, whether you want to call men and blood, like fluids or whatever, from these rituals. Either all of these men that were these children would then finish in these jars and bury them to seal whatever magical powers, were in that, or they would collect the blood from their children victims and seal them and place them in the ground. And there's like this giant geoglyph, like the Nazca lines essentially, over the Roundhouse area, and it's supposed to be like of Odin and the eye and everything. So there was like some magical properties to this property, things that Van Vloten and those people who constructed the Roundhouse and worked the Roundhouse had allegedly wanted to build. But why would they be doing all this stuff? Why would they be collecting materials like that? Why would they be carving huge into the ground? And why would these allegations even make sense? Well, we have to talk about the supposed occult rituals that happened there. The idea that the Roundhouse was an occult center where dark rituals were performed arose from the influence of Jan Eldermans, who died in 1985. Johann Montenberg, whose mother allegedly was the madam at the original and who helped bring those prostitutes and children out to the Roundhouse to be had regular contact with Jan Eldermans from 1978 onwards. And he also had contact with Hans Schalkwick, who interviewed him frequently and made use of his knowledge. Now, Jan Eldermans worked for many years at the Ministry of Justice in the Netherlands and held a high position there. And in his spare time, he was involved in investigating occult matters. When he died, Jan Eldermans' estate showed that he was particularly interested in magic, and was probably also a member of a society that was actively involved in it. There's documentation, according to the Working House group, that investigative group that was taking a look at the Roundhouse, which indicates that in a conversation with Montenberg, Elderman confirmed that, quote, at the Roundhouse, people practiced a Germano-Celtic cult in which took place, and children of about 10 or 12 were held against their will, end quote. It should be noted that Jan Elderman's parents had a holiday home built in Nunspeet nearby the Roundhouse in the year 1920. When he was there as a youth, he came into contact with someone who told him a lot about gnomes. Yes, gnomes, the short mythical creatures. Although Jan Eldermans wasn't convinced of the existence of gnomes and never saw one himself, he then began collecting folk tales and testimonies about gnomes from that time forward. Real accounts from real people who claimed they had seen and encountered these things, stories which depicted these gnomes as not always being as benign as they are in children's stories. Jan also knew a lot about objects and rituals that were needed to attract or ward off gnomes. Before his death, he went through and destroyed many of his thousands of pages of notes, images, and self-made drawings from his research. The working group, the investigative group, suspects that Jan wanted to prevent unskilled people from performing the dangerous occult rituals that he described in his writings. Approximately 2,500 pages and 187 objects were preserved and donated by his son-in-law to the Museum of Witchcraft in Cornwall. This collection shows that Jan Eldermans had a fascination with the phallus, which could explain why the working group or investigation group thought they had discovered a phallus in the forest around the Roundhouse. Jan Eldermans additionally confirmed that he had visited Frank Van Vloten as a young man and met with him. They had talked about old Germanic rites and customs, including rituals. Jan Eldermans, at the end of his life, claimed that he thought that the Roundhouse was an occult building, although, according to others, Frank Van Vloten had been inspired by a house he had seen in Spain. Jan Eldermans had heard that there was a pan-Germanic movement in Germany that assumed that the famous Battle of Varus that took place in 9 AD hadn't taken place in the Teutoburg forest, but near the Misty on the Vlu in the area of the Roundhouse. To give you some context, during that battle, German soldiers hacked thousands of Roman soldiers to pieces. It was an absolutely gruesome, bloody mess, and some of these soldiers were sacrificed to Wodan, the mythical god. And remember, Wodan is supposedly the thing that is depicted in the glyph that's on the grounds of the Roundhouse. So all these stories are connecting. They believe that this battle where thousands of men were slaughtered and sacrificed to Wodan took place near the Roundhouse, and then there's this glyph that is appearing on the Roundhouse property that looks exactly like Wodan, and apparently Frank Van Vloten had conversations with this guy when he was younger about this Germanic movement and how there was like German influence and blah blah blah, and these were German soldiers that slaughtered these people, and then there's the German, thing in that German supposed ritual grounds where they uncovered those honeypots. There's just so much here. I'm sorry if this is a little confusing. It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre stuff. And in addition, going with this German concept, there was also a Germanic holy line running through the area right near the Roundhouse, comparable to a ley line. If you know what a ley line is, it's essentially like a line of energy that runs across the world, and there are a lot of areas where these ley lines intersect, where there are incredibly haunted locations paranormal wise. So a Germanic holy line is essentially like a ley line. It comes from mystical texts, and there was a ley line going right through the Roundhouse property, and that's not by chance. Jan Eldermans also found that it was not implausible that Frank Van Vloten had built his house, the Roundhouse, on behalf of an occult Germanic society. The location of the Roundhouse was very suitable for this Germanic society's rituals. According to the investigation group, Montenberg's birthplace was also on top of the holy line. He was born directly on top of the line. This could explain why his mother became involved in these Germanic rituals, perhaps as a high priestess. Now, when this investigative group confronted Montenberg with all this evidence, he blushed and refused to talk to them, which the working group interpreted as being on the right track. It's almost like they had called him out right to his face, and he was almost a little bit scared or nervous about what they might call him out on next. They were getting deeper and deeper into the truth behind the Roundhouse, and he didn't really like it anymore. Now, in Schalkwick's book, there's an eyewitness account of a ritual that's said to have taken place at a small lake near the excavation site during the First World War. According to the book, this eyewitness account was written down by a painter from nearby Nunspeed, who heard about it from somebody else. The informant saw a number of young girls on the shore in the evening, standing in a small semicircle with kerosene lamps. In front of them stood a sturdy woman that looked to be around 40 years old. All the girls and the woman raised their right hand with 2 fingers up. It looked like an oath-taking, and there was also eerie singing in the background. Suddenly, a number of men walked up to the girls from the forest. The eyewitness was shocked and ran away as quickly as possible. The investigative group also reported that the participants were imitators of J.J. Bakulfia's theory of civilization, which consists of the following information. In phase 1 of this theory, members came strongly to the practices of what also happened on Epstein Island, and what the Cosmicer sought with their worship of the Eros, a great orgy, take everything you can of cross-border behavior. Quote, the first was that of haterism, or Aphroditism, a stage of sexual promiscuity and social anarchy very close to the original state of nature. During this stage, humans lived in swamps without any legal and ethical obligation, and women suffered complete domination by every male component of the horde. End quote. Those who want to live closer to nature loose, uninhibited by moral laws. In response to this, the gynocracy would have arisen, a matriarchate with a lunar cult that worships Demeter, succeeded by a Dionysian era, ecstasy, and then the patriarchate. Bakunin sees that the Apollonic Greek sun god patriarchate elaborated in the Greco-Roman legislation and then Christianity. The victory of spirit over matter, of culture over nature, of reason over instinct, but also of arbitrary power over freedom, or social hierarchy over communal unity, or violence over peace. So it's basically explaining that the people who were into this theory, I know that that was a lot once again, but they were into an almost anarchistic way of life, total uninhibited sex and dominance and hedonism and, control and power. And they believed that, some of them believed that living life like that, taking what you want when you want it, doing whatever to anybody to get power and live as, freely as possible, that's what they believed in. And so obviously going out to the Roundhouse in the area that's completely in the middle of nowhere, that's guarded by lots of armed people, and doing rituals like this by the river or the lake, essentially being able to live life like this, it makes a lot of sense. In addition, Frank Van Vloten, the man who built the Roundhouse, all of his sisters all married important artists from the Tack Tigers, a group of individuals that were somewhat infamous, including psychiatrist Frederick Van Eaton, who founded the Walden Commune, and Albert Verwey. There was also a man in this group named Louis Couperus, who was infamous for his published seance book, Distill Crocked. But that last connection between Frank Van Vloten and the man Albert Verwey is one of the most interesting in this entire story. As already described in the story in England about the Avalonians and the revival of Glastonbury, Spiritism lived strongly at the end of the 19th century, and with it also the interest in pre-Christian religions, kind of like paganism, with the founder of Theosophy, Madame Blavatsky, as the Spiritist pivot. And through this movement, the Aryan symbol, the swastika, was brought within the occult groups of that time. A group that carried that logo long before the Nazis were the Cosmicer from Schwabing, or southern Germany, where, in addition to biocentric philosopher Ludwig Klages, also Albert Verwey was affiliated, the husband of Frank Van Vloten's sister. And then comes the connection. Ludwig Klages is the writer, in 1913, of the founding manifesto of the German Greens, Mensch und Erde. Author David Cronin, in a 2024 article by the Electronica Intifada, points out that the German Greens, or the German Green Party, had a strong connection to the beliefs of the Nazi Party, citing the commonality between both strong attachment to nature, blood and soul, and men and earth, or the manifesto mentioned above. So essentially, through marriage, Frank Van Vloten was associated with an infamous, almost, I don't know if you want to call him a sorcerer or what, but a guy that was heavily involved with a German ritualistic occult group. And that's what the crux of all of these theories is about, is this Germanic sort of ritual and worship that took place on the Roundhouse property, the worshiping of children to appease these gods and to gain power, living hedonistic lifestyles and, and taking whoever you wanted, men, women, children, the geoglyphs that were carved into the ground that had supposed, relations to famous German massacres that took place supposedly in the area. I mean, there's so many connections here. And then you have all the eyewitnesses, people from the town who said that, my sister went to go work at the out there and she never returned. You have the eyewitnesses, people that supposedly visited there and saw all these children that were I don't even know exactly what had been done to them, but they were called dolls because they didn't move, they didn't talk, they were just sitting there basically waiting to be used time and time again. All of the materials that were brought out to the Roundhouse that were never explained, what they did with all of them, all the tunnels and passages that even to this day people have discovered that exist in the Roundhouse area. Weird, right? But to be fair, we have to point out a couple of the inconsistencies that people discuss when it comes to this story. Now, if you'll remember, the first article that was published that really broke the story was the article published by the man with the last name Scepter. His article, obviously, when it was published, was heavily criticized, as these articles always are. Any whistleblowing article or program is going to be criticized by those in power, especially those, in the press or in the political world. And people claim that, yeah, the rich people did get off on the wrong side of the train so that they wouldn't be seen, but they did so because they didn't want to walk around the entire train. They wanted to just get off on the correct side so they could leave, which I guess, you could make the argument, but that explanation completely discounts all the stories and eyewitnesses and people who actually brought these men in this dark, cart, not only to the where the kids were being held hostage, but also out to the Roundhouse. They also claimed that there were Belgian prostitutes in the area during the war, but they said that they were in the Nunspeet refugee camp, not in that. Which, again, how do you know that? It just ignores all the eyewitnesses and people who've testified about this stuff. Scepter, the author of that article, also said that after the article was published, his own mother received death threats because her address was published at the bottom of the article. And he also claimed that people allegedly tried to kill him by cutting the brake lines of his car. He then wrote a second article trying to appease people, correcting some of his so-called mistakes, but the article was never published. And the anger from locals and people in the higher up of the government got so strong against him that he actually had to flee to Canada to find safety. People were threatening his life every single day for exposing this truth. However, Schalkwyk, that investigator who previously worked at a bank, told a journalist from newspaper De Stentor that there were many untruths circulating about the Roundhouse. He said, "There's no network." He said that the women involved were actually foreign prostitutes. He also claimed that Frank Van Vloten had never rode with a naked girl on his horse and that no human remains had ever been dug up at the Roundhouse. He said there was no traces of an underground tunnel system in the forest, and he also said that he didn't believe that Scepter, that author, had been threatened. Additionally, there were several misreports from Schalkwyk and his working group, along with a lack of evidence regarding the information they claimed was solid, according to a 2013 article by Agnes Tebin. When asked about the occult group that was active at the Roundhouse, Schalkwyk and his work group were unable to answer. The question was asked at a presentation of Schalkwyk's book by none other than Theo Pagemans, who was a historian who specialized in occult societies. After being asked the question, almost no information at the time about the rituals was provided. But there's also one interesting piece of information here that led that investigative group to believe that there were indeed ritual that happened on the Roundhouse property. And the evidence that they discovered that led them to believe that is pretty interesting. This is a quote that they discovered somewhere along their investigation. It said, "The dark forces were called upon to bring about the German victory at the front in France." This is referring to World War I. However, when the German armies were finally defeated in November 1918, it was clear that the experiments at the occult testing ground in Nunspeet had failed, and they were therefore stopped, end quote. So they're basically saying that some of these rituals, if not all of them that were happening at the Roundhouse, were supposedly being done to bring forth a German victory in World War I. They were these children and committing these atrocities against kids, having with minors and doing all of these things out there as a part of some mass ritual at a, experimentation ground to try bring about a German victory in World War I. But when they saw that Germany lost the war, they gave up on the rituals and tried to conceal all of the evidence that they had ever happened in the first place. And this is interesting. You remember that forum where they had 75,000 comments and people talking about what they had heard about the Roundhouse and the rituals that happened there? Well, one interesting story came forward about that psychic that I discussed before named Delius Pitt, who went into a trance at the lake on the Roundhouse property in March 1980. Delius had been brought out to the lake by investigators. He went into this trance, and this was before a lot of this knowledge was even known or understood. But the psychic during that trance appeared to have seen almost exactly the same thing that the witness saw in the book. The psychic was standing by the lake. This is before the eyewitness's account had been gathered and fully published, and he claimed that he saw a group of young girls, holding their arms up, men men surrounding them. He saw essentially what the eyewitness would later go on to say that he had seen. But his account wasn't published, so there's no way that either of them, if you get what I'm saying, knew what the other one had said. Like, the psychic's report wasn't published, and the painter who actually physically claimed he saw this stuff happen, his account hadn't been published either. So they were corroborating each other in these weird psychic ways. And according to people who knew members that were in that investigative group that were taking a look at the Roundhouse allegations, that psychic played an important role when the investigation had stalled in 1980. They consulted this psychic, and he frequently told them where they should look next, where new information could be found, and he could tell them stories about the house that nobody had ever revealed before. And oftentimes when they followed up on these leads from the psychic, they would indeed find information, or these stories that he talked about, years before, they would eventually talk to a witness who would confirm that that exact thing had happened. The psychic also claimed that he knew when a witness had not revealed his true colors and had to be questioned again. So this psychic would be able to tell when people were lying to the investigators, and he would tell them, you should go re-ask this person the same questions and demand that they tell you the truth. Then the group would go reinvestigate, re-interview the same person and tell them that they knew they were lying, and they'd tell them the truth. Really weird stuff. However, the book that was published mentions nothing about the psychic at all. This is just all information gathered from other reports. It's really weird. And the role of Prince Hendrik, who was alleged to have participated in the things that happened there, also remains unclear. The only evidence is a virtually illegible note that was found with the notes from the grandfather of a woman who had been contacted in 2006. Montenberg, one of the original guys that had been talking about all this, and if you remember, Montenberg's mother was supposedly the in helping procure prostitutes and children for ritual. He had already given a vague indication in this direction a long time ago, indicating that a prince had been involved with what was happening at the Roundhouse. The grandfather had recorded a conversation with a certain person named H, who reported on a murderous ritual. Now, for some reason, the investigative group has still to this day not talked about this ritual in detail. They haven't revealed what the ritual allegedly entailed, but they have stated publicly that they wonder if the H on that note that talks about this murder references Prince Hendrik or Highness. Could the prince have been involved in a ritual for some sort of security reasons? Could he have wanted to attend a ritual at the Roundhouse because he thought it could help them win a war or help him gain more power? Or was the prince one of the members of the ring that was operating supposedly at the Roundhouse? Or if you'll remember, towards the beginning of this episode, we talked about how allegedly all of the powerful men who were there at the Roundhouse would go out for a nightly ritual where the one man would do something to a child or a woman in front of the other men, and that would be some sort of an insurance, policy to make sure that no one ever ratted. Could the prince have taken part in that? Could he have done something to a child in front of this group of other powerful men? And that's why the truth about him was never revealed, or he never revealed any truth because he's, essentially blackmailed or compromised. I don't know. At the end of the day, even though this story has been debated very, very widely in the Netherlands, and some people believe that it's true, others don't, I genuinely am from the camp, obviously because I host the show, that a story cannot grow and proliferate if there's no truth to it at all. Like, where would all these allegations and rumors come from? And it's always so easy to write something off as being so fantastic or unbelievable that there's no way it could be true. But there's always truth to these stories. I mean, think about all the eyewitnesses that I just went into detail with you about. The people who claim to have visited the Roundhouse, who saw the children dressed as dolls and wearing these weird things not moving. The eyewitnesses who saw rituals taking place on the lake. The psychics, whether you believe in psychics or not, but the psychics who saw things and received messages about things that ended up, being alleged later on. And all the glyphs that were seen, on the property, the supposed gigantic those excavated, all the honeypots and all of those weird items and things that were discovered buried in the ground, the allegations of children being forced to work in these and never being allowed to leave, the whispers in the local town about the powerful men that would take the hidden tram to the Roundhouse or to other areas. I mean, there's so much information here that, as I always say on this show, when there's smoke, there's usually fire. And I don't know. It's just crazy to me. It's crazy to me that things like this could have happened. Usually we hear stories about rings like this that were in operation in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, but more of a historical ring like this back in the early 1900s is crazy to think about. That there is probably so much history like this around the world in every single country that was just completely covered up and will remain covered up because it's just so unbelievable. And back then, I mean, if you didn't keep a record of something, who's going to remember it or talk about it? If Epstein, a person like Epstein who was children, happened in 1910, they easily could have every single person involved, and they easily could have gotten away with burning every file. It was before investigative authorities and investigative bodies and agencies were even, a thing. So there was no database of information. There was no place to store information about stuff like this. But as always, let me know what your thoughts are about this story in the comments. This was a pretty crazy one, and I believe it. I believe that there's some definite strangeness and shady that happened at the Roundhouse. What about you guys? Just let me know. If you're watching on YouTube, let me know in the comment section. And if you're listening, please be sure to leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps if you guys comment and interact with, whether you're listening to the podcast or you're watching it. It helps so much. And it's also great to hear from everybody. But until next Wednesday, you guys have a great rest of your week. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget you can check out my other podcast that I co-host with Courtney, Murder in America, or my main YouTube channel, The Paranormal Files, if you want more documentaries. Keep that tinfoil hat on, question everything, and I'll see you next time.